Today I'm going to talk about non-binary feminism, and this is, basically an accumulation of personal reflections as well as some learnings that I've been doing in the past month, and would like to share it with all of you. So to start, what is non-binary feminism and what's happening today? So I'm going to start with some terminology and some basic questions just to get everyone on board. Then continue with a presentation of the historic construction of the gender binary. Then the history of feminism in connection to the gender binary. Then inclusive feminism, and at last the transformative power of non-binary feminism. So to start, terminology. So when we're talking about gender studies or when we're talking about non-binary, a lot of the times I encounter a lot of people being very confused and saying, "God, there's so much terminology, I don't understand what's going on." So I thought I would just give some really basic definitions so that we all know what's happening. And these definitions are my personal definitions. Other people might define certain topics or certain concepts a bit different. But yeah, so for the basic definition that I have for gender is that gender is a relational, context-dependent, fictitious, performative concept based on reductionist interpretation of biology and anatomy. So basically, according from your anatomy or your primary sex organs, you're assigned a sex at birth, and then you carry this, and then according to the sex, you develop or you get assigned a gender, which is then usually, in our case in the Western world, male or female. And then you live with this gender even though you didn't choose it. And it's a bit arbitrary apart from the fact that you might have certain biological features. So that's my definition of gender. And then to continue, gender binary. So this is the idea that man and woman are oppositional to each other and that these two categories are mutually exclusive, the former being superior to the latter. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And then to continue to the third term, it's cisgender. So that means that the identification with the gender you were assigned at birth. So that's the case when someone was assigned female at birth, and then when that person is older, 20, 40, 60, 80, whatever, they feel comfortable with the female gender. And then you have the opposite, which is trans, or people make it out to be the opposite, which is the non-identification with the gender you were assigned at birth. And that can mean various different things. That can mean that you're not identifying with gender at all. That can mean you identify with both genders, or that can mean that you transition or affirm your gender from one to the other. So that would be like a medical transition, for instance. And then you have non-binary and genderqueer, which I already hinted at, which is the identification with both or neither of the two binary genders. And it serves as an umbrella term for any form of gender non-conforming identity. And it's very important to think that there's no one definition of who a non-binary person is, which brings me to my next slide. What is non-binary? There's not one non-binary experience, and we are not the third gender. So a lot of the times people would say that, okay, you're not man, you're not woman, you're a third something, which again leads to the idea that it's all one pile. And also there's often the idea that you have to be androgynous to be a non-binary, meaning that you display features of femininity and masculinity to a roughly even amount. And I would say that non-binary can mean that. It can mean that you're androgynous and that you have high display of femininity as well as masculinity, or you like to express both both the feminine and the masculine of you, but it can also mean that you're completely feminine, but you just don't associate with the label woman. And it can also mean that you just don't associate with any term. So I think in that sense, what is really important that there is also, like, just as much as there's like cis heteronormativity, there's also trans normativity. So a lot of the times there's a certain expectation on how you should look and how you should behave and how you should be as a trans person or as a non-binary person. And I really strongly advocate to refute this idea. And for me, being non-binary is very much about finding your own identity and finding how you would like to define yourself. And yeah, which means that I believe that everyone has their own gender. So you might identify as non-binary, but you have a different gender as your friend that is also defining themselves as non-binary, for instance. And that being said, also means that I'm in no way representative of the non-binary community, as I am just one of the many genders that are present in the non-binary community or in the genderqueer community. Maybe just to make this terminology also clear, I personally use non-binary and genderqueer as interchangeable. Some people might associate more with non-binary or with genderqueer, but for me personally, both apply. For me, non-binary is a bit more personal, while genderqueer is more political, to really challenge and deconstruct the notion of gender as a whole and queering this idea of the gender binary. But that's just me. So when I'm saying that I'm in no way representative of the non-binary community, then what's my use? So what I'm here to do is offer my perspective as a white, non-binary, able-bodied, middle-class human being living outside conventional ideas of gender and owning it. So that means I have certain privileges as a non-binary white person that other non-binary people might not have. And but it also means that because of my non-binary identity, I have certain privileges not that cisgender people have. So I think in this, it's very important to acknowledge your own positionality. And I'm continuously trying to do that. But what I'm also what I'm here for today is to dismantle the idea of the gender binary as a whole, because for me it is an oppressive force. And later on I will explain why. And also what I think is very important and what I want to highlight in this talk today is the intersection between gender and race and other forms of discrimination in the context of the gender binary. Because I think the construction of the gender binary is very deeply entrenched within the systems of oppression. And I will also explain later why. And then I want to propose a new framework for an inclusive form of feminism, because we're doing this talk in the context of the Feminist Strike Week, the 8th of March, the International Day Against Gender-Based Violence, coming up on Monday. So I think this is what my idea was, to think a bit, how can feminism look like today to be truly inclusive and to take as many people on board as possible. And then last point is that I want to bring the conversation about trans and gender non-conforming people to continental Europe and normalize gender non-conformity. Because when I do research or when I look at other gender non-conforming people, most of them are based in North America and particularly in the United States. And I don't see so much of a trans movement or gender nonconformity movement in Europe happening. And I think that's quite tragic. And I think it's very important to also start these conversations here and be more active. I mean, in the last years, it's starting more and more with like using gender neutral language, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done. So who am I? So everybody seems to have many questions when meeting me and when I'm explaining that I'm non-binary. And it doesn't fit quite so well with so many people, and they think that then I'm some running around dictionary and can answer a lot of questions. So I'm usually getting questions and comments like these that I put in the presentation, which is like, yeah, so how does it work? So why you have to make it so hard for me? Now I have to use different pronouns. That's so difficult. And wow, also interesting. My first ever boyfriend was also very feminine. I think that's cute. And these questions and comments are, I know that like you mostly they come from a place of curiosity and interest, but a lot of the times they're also quite annoying because they're very repetitive for me. And sometimes they're also not accurate because I don't want to be compared to someone's first boyfriend. And yeah, exactly. So I'm usually confronted with this sort of projection because a lot of people don't understand or are not doing the education themselves to really understand what I'm doing and who I am as a non-binary person. So who I am really, my name is Béla Belissima and I'm non-binary genderqueer, in case you haven't figured that out yet. And I'm studying in Maastricht in the Netherlands, and since identifying as non-binary, I have been unlearning expectations of being assigned male at birth and unpacking this concept of how I was always forced into this certain template of human being development, which I felt was quite limiting to me in my personal freedom and my personal expression. So I'm unlearning that. And this is quite a difficult process and quite challenging process because it is so deeply ingrained in everything we do that everything we do in our lives is gendered. So I think this unlearning is very much a process, and I want to also embrace it as a process because otherwise it can feel quite overwhelming, at least to me. And then I'm relearning to love myself unconditionally, because I think a lot of times when I was younger, I was forcing myself to be some kind of version of myself that I was not, but therefore complying to expectations and stereotypes of who a male should be, and realized that I really lost touch with myself because of that. And so I also lost this access to self-love and this access to my authenticity. So I'm relearning that as well. And then the last one is that next to doing this process myself, I also want to take it a little bit more on a bigger scale and challenging the cisgendered reality through artistic expression. And this is why I started my podcast, Queering the Perspective, in January this year, which is a project in which I'm talking in each episode with one guest about any topic regarding gender and power relations that they personally are interested in and that they want to talk about. And so it's a space for empowerment, it's a space for authenticity beyond the cisgendered world. So this is who I am. And now let's get into it. So that's the first part, or the second part of this lecture, is the historical construction of the gender binary. And what I find really crucial in understanding when thinking about the gender binary is that a lot of the times it is framed as if gender nonconformity is something new. And that it is something like, yeah, there's some trend, it's a phase, it's some young people having fun on Tumblr and these like gender snowflakes, and there's very like transphobic discourse around it, really not legitimizing this identity as an identity, but just as some kind of experiment and fun. And while you can of course claim like, no, it's me, this is forever, and this is very authentic who I am, what is even more powerful to me is a look into history, because gender nonconforming people have existed throughout global history, basically, and which you can see in many examples throughout space and time. So the Hijra, for example, that have lived in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and still continue to do so today. For example, and here on the right, this picture is Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And basically, she is a transgender activist, actress, and motivational speaker, and has been on the forefront of fighting for the rights of Hijra people within India in the last years. But the Hijra people have existed always in India and have been also throughout most of the history recognized as spiritual leaders. And then you have the tomboys, for example, in Indonesia. You have two-spirited people in First Nations throughout North America. And these are just 3 examples. There's many, many more. And I think the fact that nobody really knows about it is because our history has been cisgendered. So a lot of the times when we think about history now, we would learn about the Enlightenment, we would learn about the French Revolution, the World Wars, but we would never learn about people living outside the gender binary, or at least I did not at all during my education. And yeah, but I think it is very important to embed the struggle of non-binary and gender non-conforming people and trans people today within a continuum of history. So while non-binary and while gender non-conforming individuals have always existed, we're now finding the language to really give them a space to exist. And I think it's very important, or at least for me, it's important to see that I'm existing because of this legacy, that I'm existing because people before me have lived outside the gender binary. And I will also return to this point a bit later. So what has changed? So if there have been historically always people living outside the gender binary, then why is that not so much the case anymore? Or why did that seem to be erased? So basically is that what's the case is that gender, or to be precise, the gender binary, was introduced as a patriarchal and colonial project with the aim of subordination of women, gender non-conforming individuals, as well as the native population. And that dates back to settler colonialism of different European countries. And yes, so to start off with the first part of the gender binary as patriarchal or misogynist, is that through the gender binary, womanhood was invented as a thing. Before that, in many native populations, women didn't exist in the idea that they existed after the introduction of the gender binary. So in many cases, women and men were wearing similar clothing, were doing similar jobs, similar duties, and you didn't have this clear definition of like, okay, this is what women are, this is what men are. And then and what happened was that this, especially in the context of Britain, this idea of Victorian modesty for women was introduced as opposed to rational masculinity, which was part of, like, during the time of the Enlightenment, it was a way of opposing the women to the men and thereby remaining or retaining control. And there also the sexless woman was invented, for example. So women were not supposed to have pleasure, women were not supposed to have orgasms, women were not supposed to enjoy themselves, and instead they were they had their sole or their main function was to do domestic duties and to breed the race. So to reproduce the race, and a lot of the times this reduction towards reproduction framed women in this very one-dimensional way. And then of course also that had a colonial connotation, because when you have women and men in this very strict binary opposition in the idea of the nuclear family, so mother, father, children, that's also a way to develop and maintain the control of the empire. So, and to expand the empire like constantly. So the British Empire, I think, is the biggest example of that, where really through advertisement, through commercial products, this idea of the modest woman was a way to expand the British Empire. And then this was tied, as I already said, to clothing in many social places in the society. So for instance, women were supposed to wear dresses and men were supposed to wear pants. And so that, and dresses were worn in the private and pants were worn in the public. So that also prohibited women to a certain extent to access the private sphere, which was also then the place for trade, which was the place for commerce, and it confined them to dependency within the domestic sphere. Yeah, so I already talked a bit about the colonial aspect of it, but yeah, basically, the gender binary can be seen as a control mechanism. So it's a policing, it's an imposition of a certain idea of how society should look like, and it's a policing of clothing, it's a policing of duties, and it's a very strict definition of how people are supposed to interact. And then also there's this interesting aspect of spirituality. So while in many indigenous communities, femininity was highly regarded as being closer to God, as being more divine, and having therefore a very special place in society. Through Christianity, this idea was completely reduced or completely eradicated, because in Christianity there was a clear idea that women were the weaker sex. If you think about that, like Eve was carved out of the chest of Adam or something like this, and through the practices of Christianity, of course, this was reinforced. And then as well, the gender binary was a way to replace indigenous epistemologies. So different ways of thinking, different ways of interacting with the nature, with each other, with other tribes. And instead, the gender binary imposed also Western ideas of industrialization, reproduction, efficiency, and yeah, basically sort of the roots of capitalism. So yeah, and basically, I think I already said this a bit, but gender binary in many cases served as a tool to uphold and strengthen systems of white and cis male power and hierarchy. And yeah, I think that's very important to keep in mind, this historical development or the historical construction and the origins of the gender binary when talking about gender nonconformity today. Oops. That's why there was a slide before. Okay, I was confused. And when we think about the colonial aspect, so I already talked about it a bit, but the Enlightenment also brought with it a very racialized construction of white people versus the indigenous populations. And so there was a juxtaposition of the white people, the white settlers being civilized, and the indigenous people being the primitive other. So underdeveloped, uncivilized, savages, and that was also in relation to gender and sexuality. So different forms of sexuality and gender expression were severely oppressed by patriarchal ideas of the gender binary. And you can see different cases throughout indigenous communities of like alternative displays of gendered expression outside of the gender binary in the Western sense. And for example, Thomas Cook, when he first came to the Americas, he was noting in his diary that why are the women here so bare-chested? You know, why are they walking around without clothing? And so there was this confusion because it was a different way of being with each other, and it was a different relation to gender and sexuality. And many times, and then through colonialism, this was framed as being uncivilized and as not having learned how to properly behave and how to act with each other in a quote unquote modern way. And especially this is the case for women. So women of color were constructed as being sexually ambiguous. So by not complying to this Victorian modesty idea of a woman, they were sort of constructed as being non-woman and therefore being constructed as non-human and placed outside the binary, placed as inferior, which also then legitimizes this quote unquote white man's burden. So this idea that white people had to go to the colonies in order to civilize the people that were living there. And so this white man's burden was really closely tied to the idea of the gender binary, which I think is a very important component to understand. And in many ways, gender normativity, as we know it today, is whiteness. So it's a white project. And we already had this slide. No, but there was. And then there's one case example which really makes this clear. There are many more case examples, but I wanted to focus on one in order to not expand too much. So the case example is the Yoruba people, which live in what today is Nigeria. And basically prior to colonization, the category woman did not exist. So gender was not really a marker of social hierarchy. It was simply yet another factor of who people were. And there was of course reproduction happening also within the Yoruba, but that was just the fact that some people were birth givers, nothing else. And then when the British came and colonized the land, they imposed Western gender norms and introduced forced assimilation into this Western norms. And so basically and what they did was denying women the access to education, and where they were also erasing any form of gender non-conforming spirituality. For example, when you look at the picture on the right, this is the divine god or goddess of Ududuwa. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But it's basically a goddess of the Yoruba people that has been gender fluid. So at some point they were seen as female, and then at other points seen as male. And so it shows a bit of how gender did not play such a significant role in the thinking of people. And then through the imposition of the gender binary and Western gender norms through the British, of course, gender inequality was increasing because women were categorically denied rights. And what we learned through this example is that gender categories are not universal and that they are not binary. So when today a lot of people say like, oh yeah, but men and women just exist, that's just a thing, you know, that's all over the world, and you cannot argue against biology, then these examples show that this is very much not the case, and that categories have been constructed based on arbitrary bodily features. So I think with this, I would like to continue with the history of feminism. It might seem a bit abstract now, but I think where the link is that in this example of the Yoruba, the women were clearly disadvantaged through the invention of womanhood. And now, there's the transition to how women have historically fought for their rights. So yeah, that was also before. So the gender binary is a white and racist invention. So history of feminism. So as much as with gender binary, there's today a common belief of feminism to be a universal thing. So it's a fight of gender equality for all women, And however, historically, that has also not always been the case. And I want to illustrate this claim through the 3 distinguishable waves of feminism. And I'm sure some of you have already heard about it, so I will not go into too much detail. And sorry if it might seem a bit rushed now, but yeah. So the first wave were the suffragists or the suffragettes. Basically in the late 19th and the early 20th century, they were fighting for the women's rights to vote, for women to have access to the public. But there's an important differentiation to make here. So you have the suffragists, which were fighting for middle-class, property-owning women and were using forms of peaceful protest. And then you have suffragettes, which were a more inclusive advocacy and radical in their approach. So they would also use methods of civil disobedience in order to make their voices heard, and then go on hunger strike when being imprisoned. But I think, and in media display it, of course, the suffragists were seen as the modest women, the rational women that were just, trying to make their voices heard. And the suffragettes were the radicals, the voices that shouldn't be listened to because they are using tactics which are not adequate, which are not legitimizable. And so the claims of the suffragists were more valued, of course, and also because they were not fighting to radically change the system of gender oppression, but they were just fighting for the right to vote. And they were also not having a very inclusive idea about women. So they didn't include, for example, lower class women as much as in their struggle. They didn't include Black women and women of color. And so I think already in this first wave of feminism, you can see that it was not a fight for universal rights, but rather a fight for the rights of a certain part of the population. And then this continued in the second wave of feminism, which was the women's rights movement. And then now this is in the US context, but also in Europe. This movement started around the 60s, the 70s, and basically it was a fight for the self-determination over women's own bodies, regarding safe and free abortion, as well as access to the pill. And they wanted to redefine women's place in the society. So away from this sort of confinement to the domestic sphere, and instead having access to the public life and being more independent and not just, the property of the husband. And what they made, what was very powerful, which was this sex-gender distinction. And there's this really famous quote of Simone de Beauvoir saying that one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one. So basically they were saying that like the sex is biological, but the gender is learned. So through that distinction, the idea that woman is some sort of biologically determined group of people was refuted, and therefore also women's rights advanced. But the problem is that most of the women fighting in the women's rights movement were white, middle-class, heterosexual women. For example, icons such as Gloria Steinem or Betty Friedman. And again, it didn't include women of color very much, and it didn't include lower class women, and it didn't, in general, didn't make any intersections. It was just this idea of woman. So like also in a very essentializing notion of womanhood. So yeah, basically this is what I just said. And maybe to add that also through the women's rights movement, there was a lack of an institutional analysis of power dynamics. So you didn't have so much this, the analysis or the understanding that women's oppression were based on a global system of power power dynamics. And this understanding changed a bit with the third wave of feminism, which was intersectionality. And this term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a legal scholar, and she coined it in her 1989 paper called Demarginalization, the Intersection Between Race and Gender, based on legal cases where women of color have been denied access to jobs. And these claims that the women were making in the legal cases did not hold up, because the employers were arguing, yeah, but we're hiring Black men and we're hiring women also, so this is not any categorical discrimination. But then Kimberly Crenshaw made the point that exactly their identity as Black women made them not being hired. And afterwards, this concept was used and expanded to include various other intersecting forms of identity, such as ability, faith, place of birth, race, class. And basically, she introduced the idea that identity is multiple and complex and intersecting. And maybe it's just important to point out that she was not the first to introduce this concept. The concept was long talked about, and there's been already like Black female activists in the 19th century saying that Black women have a special place because of this intersecting identity. But she was really the person who coined this term intersectionality, on which a lot of scholars afterwards have built their work, such as these scholars, which is just a small list I wanted to give to think about who, which is just a small list that I wanted to give about other Black scholars writing about intersectionality. So on the top, you have from left to right, Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, and Angela Davis, who also all very much took a lot of emphasis on the idea of class and a critique of capitalism, with intersecting with gender and race. And then in the German context, you have, and this is a bit more recent now, so you have Natasha A. Kelly, Emilia Roig, and also Michaela Dudley, which are also pushing for this debate to really enter the German discourse around gender and race. And so I just wanted to highlight their perspective, because I think it's very important that whenever we talk about anything related to identity, that we talk about it in the context of intersectionality. So after now talking about the gender binary as well as the history of feminism, I would like to continue with trans-inclusive feminism, because what I believe is that trans people make feminism more powerful. So we have seen that the gender binary was a construction, the notion of women was a construction, and what trans-inclusive feminism does is decoupling the idea that femininity is equal to womanhood. So it does not mean that when you're feminine, you're a woman. And it also doesn't mean that as a woman, you must be feminine. And so I think that is something that's very important, that really trans people, be it gender non-conforming people or be it binary trans people, can contribute to feminism. And I think it's very tragic that nowadays you have a lot of TERFs, trans-exclusive radical feminists, who are basically regrouping around the idea of the essential woman, and thereby throwing under the bus everyone else that that is also discriminated against based on their gender. And I think trans-inclusive feminism is so powerful because you're refuting reductionism and you're refuting universalism, and you're paying more attention to the human being as an individual and perceiving gender as a multiplicity, as well as identity as a multiplicity. And it's also, particularly in the context of gender non-conforming people, it's also liberating from expectations. So I think what I really wanted to highlight before is that the gender binary was not only to exclude gender non-conforming people from any form of existence or from any form of respectable existence, but it was also a misogynist idea in itself, because there were certain expectations placed upon women, and there was this sort of template culture that you were born and then you're following a certain template until you die. And I think trans-inclusive feminism helps to challenge this idea. So, yeah, so to connect to that, what is non-binary to me against the backdrop of this sort of knowledge is that you are an individual person and you are worthy and you are loved and you are appreciated regardless of any expectations placed upon you. And while and that there's no need to justify your existence. So you don't have to fit into a prescripted version of how you should be, but it's a way, like being non-binary is a way to find your true authentic self. Yeah, refuting this normativity. And then for me, very personally, what it also means is overcoming femphobia. And here again, I want to stress that I'm not speaking for the non-binary community, but I'm speaking from my own perspective, is that a lot of the times that I was scared about my femininity and I was ashamed of my femininity, I was embarrassed and I didn't want it to exist because I was told that being feminine is weak and being feminine is not something you do as a boy. And while I'm now realizing more and more that being feminine or being femme, which means non-normative versions of femininity, is power. And it's really really reaching a place where you can know yourself, where you can feel very spiritually connected to who you are, and where you can also feel very, I mean, maybe now it's a little bit spiritual, but you can feel really a divine connection to a certain extent. I mean, this is really, again, just my personal perspective, but I find it very powerful to also play with my femininity and to express myself the way that I want to, and regardless of norms. Yeah. So, what feminism could look like today, based on this account of my experiences, as well as trans-inclusive feminism in general, is that feminism could look like, I didn't want to put should, but I think also should might be applicable, could look like collective rethinking of norms and collective resistance to an essentialist idea of the inferior woman and to a patriarchal structuring of our society, as well as a collective liberation from these forms of oppression. So I think in order to reach to this place, we all need to think and reflect about how our feminism looks like today, which is basic. And for this, I noted down a few questions. So, does your feminism include Black women and women of color? Does your feminism include trans and non-binary people of color? Does your feminism include disabled people of color? And does your feminism include people of other faiths? And if yes, does this inclusion fall under the rescue narrative, that you want to rescue the headscarf wearing woman or the woman with the burqa from their eternally oppressive patriarchs? Or is it actually a conscious reaching out to them and see how they are feeling in their expression of themselves? And then a last question is your feminism anti-capitalist? And I think being inclusive, and in that sense being trans inclusive, being gender non-conforming people inclusive, also like should mean including also a lot of other intersections such as these ones. And I'm sure that this is for many also a process, and for many we've been also socialized in a way that the normalcy, like the construction of how our world looks like, does not include these intersections. So many times maybe you live in communities where there's not many Black people or people of color, or not many disabled people, and it's easy to forget that also different experiences exist. But I think there we must ask ourselves the question, is your feminism, or is our feminism to a certain extent a white and trans excluding project? And I'm saying this from my perspective as a white, gender non-conforming person. And then if this question might be answered with even a slight yes, then that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean that your feminism is worthless, but it just means, because this is not an individual analysis, this is not about your feminism is better than their feminism, my feminism is better than your feminism, but it's about it's about a systemic analysis. So we all have a lot to learn, and I think it's important to highlight that that there is a process that needs to be done, and this process can be done by aligning with other struggles. For example, aligning the feminist struggle with the struggle for liberation for people of color, and it can also align with people from lower classes or an anti-capitalist struggle. And I think what's really important in this is to listen to queer and trans people of color, which are affected by these intersecting forms of discrimination. So here I want to propose non-binary feminism as a potential solution, or at least an analytical approach to how we can reconfigure feminism, or our idea of what, or how we can make feminism have a more radical potential and being more far-reaching. And when I say non-binary, I now want to expand from the personal identity to non-binary as questioning and overcoming all binaries. So that means, for example, what I find really powerful is that the asterisks, when we think about the trans and then the star, to include within this asterisk racial justice and other intersecting identity, and account for the multiplicity of trans experiences. And so in that sense, it's not only an identity category, but a methodology. So it's a way of thinking, and it's a way of living, and which embraces uniqueness and authenticity, which fights for justice, and which embraces creative expression and creation over a sort of a predefined notion of who you are, and then discrimination based on this predefined notion of who you are. And what I find also very interesting is when we think about the pronouns, then it can also be a way to overcome Western individualism through multiplicity, because they, them is plural. And it means also that you see maybe yourself not as being an isolated individual within the system, but it can also mean that you yourself are a multiplicity already, and that you also function within a collective, that you are connected to who was there before and who will be there after, and that through this understanding of multiplicity, you can overcome this idea that you need to be this individual that needs to compete with others in order to succeed. So very much that like a neoliberal market thinking. So, and what I think is very important in all of this is a decolonization of liberation movements. which is the queer liberation, as much as the women's liberation. And when we think about the racial aspect of the construction of the gender binary, then I think challenging gender binaries or gender categories also should be regarded as an act of decolonization and should include decolonization. And I believe that race and gender, as well as sexuality, are deeply intertwined, and that also their liberation is deeply intertwined. So, and there have been many queer people and trans people, particularly of color, that have pushed for these liberation movements, particularly in the case of the queer liberation movement, when you take into account, for example, Marsha Pay It No Mind Johnson, who was one of the first trans people of color participating in the Stonewall riots in 1969 in New York. And we as queer people or as trans people exist today because of them, because they fought for our existence and they fought for the establishment of a different world and a more diverse world in terms of gender and sexuality. And I think it's very important to pay tribute to these people, to not forget them, and also look today on how you can empower trans people and Black, Indigenous, and people of color within your community and your activism. So this is what I wanted to say about trans-inclusive feminism and the transformative power that I think non-binary feminism can hold in sort of redefining how we can see intersectional feminism today. And then I want to finish with some practical notions and some takeaways. So this goes out mainly to all the people that are watching that are cisgender, but of course it's also very important resources maybe for people that define themselves as trans or gender non-conforming to also communicate this to their friends and to their family. And it's also just, again, something that is important to me and that I'm talking about from a personal perspective. So what I think is number one is to vocalize our existence and fighting against erasure. So I think in a lot of times history has been cisgendered and the existence of trans people in whichever form has been systematically erased. So in that sense, educating yourself and educating others about the history of trans and gender non-conforming people is an act of resistance against the cisnormative framing of history and of people in general. And I think doing that is very powerful already because it really legitimizes the existence of gender non-conforming people, which is questioned every day when you're visibly gender non-conforming in the public sphere. And then other more practical things would be to push for gender expansive categories on forms and documents, be this within a school context, in a university context, within a work context, within any form of government context. And I think language forms reality. So making sure that people are represented through language options is a huge step into owning your existence and knowing your place and being self-assured, which is a huge struggle for many gender non-conforming people, as far as I know. That, and also, yeah, because of that, the suicide or the depression rates amongst gender non-conforming people are amongst the highest of any population group. And so I think these are important steps to take in order to prevent that or to work against this mental health crisis of gender non-conforming people. And then another one that's very important to me personally is watch your language. And I think in a lot of languages, we use a lot of generic masculine terms. So whenever I'm in any seminar in my university, the first thing I hear is like, hey guys, how are you? And with people female presenting in the room. And it's not even like questioned at all. And I find it very strange because obviously there's not everyone is a guy, but it's just so we're so used to a generic masculine understanding of our society that we don't even question when we're called guy or dude or man, and it's even like normalized. And I think rejecting this generic masculine language is also a way of rejecting patriarchy. So yeah, that's something really important to me. And instead, there's many gender neutral versions you can use. And it might take some getting used to, but it's not the end of the world. And then this ties in with the previous point, is check your cisgender privilege. So just as much as we have white privilege, or as we have middle class privilege, upper class privilege, whatever, we also, many people have cisgender privilege. So that means that you have the luck to identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. And being aware of this fact and being aware that this is not the case for everyone makes it a lot, I think, makes it easier for you to fight for these people that are not identifying, for us that are not identifying with the gender that they were assigned at birth. But it's also, and it's a way of empathizing with the struggle to a certain extent. I think like this notion of allyship has its flaws because it centers the experience of people that are not affected. But at the same time, I also find it very useful because cisgender people can oftentimes really work on the behalf of gender non-conforming people to push for their claims and for their existence to be respected and for human dignity. Yeah. And then another one is, which ties to this notion of allyship, is call out people for misgendering us, and especially when we're not in the room. So I think in a lot of the times, or at least what I notice, is that when I'm in a room with other people, people really try to use my gender neutral pronouns. But what people have been like telling me is that a lot of the times when I'm not in the room, then it's, you know, it's like it's more easy for people to slip and to then start using the pronouns that I was assigned at birth. And so I think especially correcting misgendering in those cases really manifests the existence of a gender non-conforming identity. Yeah, so this was my takeaway one. And then another form is like to legitimize existence is to get to know trans and non-binary people. And this might be a bit difficult right now to do because of the pandemic, of course, and also because there's gender non-conforming people and trans people are not, some people cannot be so out on the street and not so present, and also because they're not being, or we are not giving space in the public, and we are not giving space in institutions. So I think now what a really powerful way to get to know and to support trans and gender non-conforming people is social media. So this is just a selection of 4 gender non-conforming or trans people that I personally follow and that I find very inspiring. And I'm just gonna go through them quickly. So the first one is Phillip, who is the first Black trans and physically disabled model represented by a major modeling agency. And yeah, she is really pushing for inclusivity within the fashion and the model industry. And they're also super beautiful. She's also super beautiful. And then another one is Seva Quinn, or Magia Prodigy, who is a gender queer person living in Berlin and very present in the ballroom scene in Berlin, and particularly very strong on manifesting a gender non-conforming category within the ballroom, within the bars of ballroom. Then you have another one, which is the account is called Bint Haram, and her name is Sarah, and they are doing a lot of femme empowerment, and which I think is a very interesting part of being non-binary, because it really shows that there's not one non-binary experience, and you also don't have to be androgynous to be non-binary, as I said in the beginning. So like, I find this very powerful. What she says here is that what they say here is that my long hair and titties affirm my non-binary gender. So it really decouples her femininity, their femininity from their womanhood. And I think it's really, really, really powerful to understand that you don't have to be in the middle between the two genders in order to be non-binary, but it's really a way of how you feel and how you relate to yourself. Yeah. And then the last one is Alok Vaid-Menon, who is a writer, a gender studies scholar, as well as a fashion designer. And they are very out and like they're very present in public. And many times they would go purposefully as visibly gender non-conforming to the streets and face a lot of street harassment, but at the same time, and then writing about it and sort of recreating this transphobic violence that they experience into artistic creation. And actually, they also created a framework, which I find very inspiring, which is the following: it's fighting with kindness. So as a gender studies scholars, their basic premise is that transphobia is projection. So it's a projection of own insecurities, and it's a projection of own fragile masculinity or internalized misogyny, but mostly fragile masculinity, because the act of transphobic violence they experience are mainly perpetrated by cisgender men. And then they ask the question, which part of yourself did you have to kill in order to survive in this world as a man? And they are actively working against this killing of femininity, this killing of any sort of vulnerability in order to survive in this world. And I think, and what they do is to empathize with the pain of the perpetrators of transphobic violence, which I know that this is also quite like harsh method, and I definitely wouldn't recommend it to anyone, because also transphobic violence in itself is horrible. But what they do is to analyze the transphobic violence that they experience on a macro level, and centering the joy of the trans experience and not the violence, and to say that they are not the flaw, but instead the flaw is the violence. And so then they use this violence to transfer it into artistic expression, which I find maybe for some people it's an interesting approach, yeah, to also be more out in public. And then one thing that's of course very important for a gender non-conforming experience is the question of pronouns. And here also for the cisgender people, I think it's very important to ask, and for everyone to ask for pronouns tirelessly, to really normalize this discussion around pronouns, and to also accept any pronouns that people are giving you. So it's not someone's, it's not their preferred pronoun, it's just their pronouns. And it's also not like, it's not a question of who they were before, but it's a question of who they are now. And so I think in that sense, it's very important to just continuously ask for pronouns. Don't assume anyone's pronouns. For example, in this case of Sarah, don't assume that she is female and she's using she, her pronouns, because they are non-binary and they're using they, them pronouns. And in general, I also would say, let's say no to assumptions. So don't judge a book by its cover. Don't think, okay, this is how a person is. Also don't assume that a person is straight. Also don't assume that a person is cisgender. And I think all from a very early age onwards, there's a lot of assumptions placed upon us based on our visible expression. And I think it's very helping for gender non-conforming people and trans people to not be constantly assumed to be something, but rather be asked what they want to be. And then in the case of misgendering, apologize and move on. It's as simple as that. The most awkward thing is if people are like, oh, I'm so sorry, I really didn't mean it. Oh my God, no, I feel so bad now. But instead, like, it happens to all of us. It happened to me just like 3 times, embarrassing enough. but then that happened and you move on. This is a process that we're all going through together. And again, you're not a bad person for learning. At least you're learning. And then the final one, and then I'm really finished. Sorry, I know I'm a bit over time, but yeah, I guess it's just passion, is to fighting the system, of course. And because the system, like slash the system, very clever. And because, as I said before, the flaw is in the system and you're not the flaw in the system, if that made sense. So you're not the problem in this whole configuration. The problem is that the system doesn't give you the space to exist and express yourself the way you want to. And I think there's in no way do you have to downplay yourself in order to fit in anywhere else. And instead, we must continuously work to change the system as an entirety in all its intersections and in all its oppressions. And here I would like to quote Rosa Luxemburg, whose 150th birthday it is today. And she said that freedom is always freedom for those who think differently. And I think we can translate that also to for those who are different or who express themselves differently. And then again, capitalism thrives through conformity, obedience, and exclusion. So in-group, out-group dynamic, where certain people are elevated in their existence while others are marginalized. And so I think challenging the system and challenging capitalism is a key in also overcoming the gender binary and vice versa. And let's not give into the temptation of assimilation. So for example, when there's this idea of homonormativity and homonationalism, and I'm really not going to get into it, I promise. But it's basically when, for example, in the queer case, for example, when now we have same-sex in Germany or in the United States, for example, same-sex marriage, and that then your activism doesn't stop, and instead, and thereby throwing other people under the bus, maybe people that that don't conform to a sex or to a gender. And the same goes with homonationalism, that you also are not like a proud gay German citizen, because by that you're also still upholding the idea of a nation state. And so I think in the sense, it's very easy to give into assimilation when you have achieved a certain level of rights and a certain level of acceptance and a certain level of recognition. But yeah, I think if we can do it, if we can achieve it, the most powerful is we must go for collective liberation. And we're not free until everyone is free, which was something that also Marsha P. Johnson constantly preached, and that I think a lot of trans people of color have internalized a lot this mindset, because they are at the most margins of intersection, they're at the most intersections of oppression. And so I think, again, to come back to this point, listening and empowering those people is also the key towards collective liberation. And that was it. Thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, comments, additions, critiques, feel free to put them in the chat. Unfortunately, I cannot hear you. So I guess I will just look at the chat and then and try to answer the questions. And I think what is really important here is that I'm also in no way an expert. What I've presented is my personal reflections and the research that I've been doing, but I'm also still learning, and I'm so curious to learn much more, and particularly when it comes to gender non-conforming history. And if you want to reach out to me also after the sessions, feel free to send me a message on Instagram or Facebook, or follow my podcast, Queering the Perspective. And there's also a Telegram podcast channel. I don't know, maybe Carla, if you can put it in the chat. that would be super nice. So if you click on this link, you get updates for the podcast. And so, yeah. So I'm gonna look in the chat now. Let's see. So funny to not hear anyone.